Do you know Illustrator? If so, you may know that the program now offers a panel called 3D and Materials, which allows you to express shapes, type, and other objects in 3D space. And as the panel's name suggests, it also offers materials. Materials are like wrappings. You are wrapped in a 3D material called skin. Your dog is wrapped in a 3D material called fur. Your tree is wrapped in a 3D material called bark. Or is that your dog? Truth be told, 3D materials are endless, not only in Illustrator, but elsewhere as well. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to show you a few classic materials right up front. We're going to get our feet wet with a look at the basics of 3D materials. And along the way, we're going to take this everyday average editable text and we're going to turn it into this sweet 3D object right here, just so that we accomplished something. Seems like that's important. But I want to start off with a definition of 3D materials. It's a noun, and no surprise there. And it's a surface composition of an object, a 3D object, which may impart color, translucency, that is see-throughness, opacity versus transparency, reflectivity, texture, and any number of custom parameters. Those parameters go on and on. But before we go any further, I want to give you a few examples, such as marble. How nice is that? Leather is an option, as is wood. You got all kinds of woods available to you, by the way. And if you thought you had a lot of woods, you have even more fabrics. Is that not cool or what? And then we've got pavement, paver stones in this case, as well as scales. So like actual skins of animals. Think of this as actually being on the snake, not on a boot. Goodness gracious, that would be horrible. As well, that's up to you. It's your lifestyle, as well as who doesn't want gold foil. And then you can even put stuff on 3D objects that you could never put on real world 3D objects, such as lava. All right, so let's take a swing at it here. How do you do it? That's the question, right? And so I'm going to just click on this editable text. Could be anything, by the way. And then I'll go up to the window menu and choose 3D and materials. Notice it even says the word materials right there. And I'm going to make it 3D by going up to the object tab, clicking on extrude, and then I'm just going to dial in a bunch of values. So I'll change the depth value to 100, so it's nice and deep. Lots of extrusion. I'll drop down to the X value and change it to 10 degrees. You could change it to anything you want. You know that. I don't need to say that. -40 for Y and -5 for Z. And we'll get this kind of text that's inclined backward. And then I'll set the perspective value to 60 degrees. It's just going to show things off nicely. Now, in order to really see a material, we want some beveled edges. That's just going to help out. So I'm going to twirl open bevel right here. I'm going to turn it on, and you can go with classic if you want to, but I'm going to change the shape to round, like so. And then I'm going to increase the width value to 100 so that we have a lot of roundness. All right, now we need to light the object, so I'll click on lighting up here at the top, and I'll change the intensity value to 100%, so very intense. I'm going to ignore rotation and height. They're fine as is. I'm going to set the softness value to 60, and I'm going to take the ambient value down to 30%. You could turn on the shadows if you want to, but I'm going to wait on that one. For now, I'm going to assign a material, and you do that by clicking on the word materials up here at the top. You want materials, not graphics. And you may see just this, the default material. We're going to come to that because it's a really important material, a learning material anyway. But if you want to assign a cool material, then twirl open this guy, Adobe Substance Materials, which are all the materials that ship along with Illustrator. And I'm just going to scroll down the stack here. Now you can play with any material you like, but initially they can be a little bit disappointing. We'll cross that bridge. I'll show you ways to make them all exciting. But for now, I'll go with wax paint just because it's a good starter material. And then I'll scroll down this properties list. And if you were to scroll down the entire thing, you'll see there's just tons and tons of properties. But usually you'll find color. And so I'll go ahead and click on that color swatch right there. And I'll dial in a color that will contrasts nicely with the background. So I'm going to change the hue value to 30 degrees, which is orange. I'll set the saturation value to 100%. Why be subtle? And I'll set the brightness value to 70%, and I'll click OK, and we end up with this bright orange stuff right here. Notice that it has some color variation, and it also has some brush intensity going on, those little lines right there. And so notice color variation and brush intensity. They vary, by the way. I'm going to show you. Color variation goes from 0 to 1, which is going to seem like a crazy dinky range, but think of it this way. If you want, one is, first of all, 0 is 0. So we're all in agreement on that one. 1 is the same as 100%. So think of these as being percentage values. Why don't they do it in percentage? Because they don't. All right, now I'm going to go back here and set color variation to the equivalent of 50%, which is 0.5. And I'm going to do the same thing. Notice we get more variation in the color. I'm going to do the same thing for brush intensity. I'm going to take it to 0.5 or 50% as well. And now we get these deeply etched brush strokes. And now what we got to do, of course, is ray trace. So I'll click on this down pointing arrowhead up here in the top right corner of the panel, and I'll turn on ray tracing. I will set the quality to neither low nor medium. Wouldn't want that. We want high. Reduce noise causes problems in this particular version of Illustrator, and that's it. So I'll turn that off, and I'll click on the render button, at which point we will see the obligatory progress bar, because after all, this is a computationally intense operation on Illustrator's part. But a moment later, we'll end up with this truly sweet 3D object right here, complete with a material which is now available to us inside Illustrator 2022 and moving forward. Now we'll take a look at what are arguably the most important properties when working with 3D materials in Illustrator, and they go by the names roughness and metallic, and they are so ubiquitous that you can really think of them as the equivalent of italic and bold. We're styling type is concerned, but we're styling 3D objects instead. Roughness is how rough the surface is. See that in a moment. And metallic is how metallic it is. Well, let me show you what I mean. I'll go ahead and switch to these demonstrations right here. And so, as I was saying before, rough properties, generally speaking, vary from 1 to 0. And so you can think of them as percentages. 0 would be the bottom, and then 0%, and then 1 is going to be 100%. And then you get to the other percentages using decimal values. And so I'm demonstrating each one of these properties here on a couple of letters that are curvy letters that are extruded with bevels, with round bevels as well, so that we can get a little bit of reflectivity. So when roughness is set to 1, we get a matte finish. In other words, there's tiny little roughness inside that 3D material, and so we don't get a lot of shine. But if you were to turn roughness down to 0, you get a ton of shine, as we're seeing right here. So that's the difference, matte and shiny. And I want you to know, in each case, the other base property is set to 0.4, just so that we're locking that property down. So in other words, when roughness is set to 1 right here, metallic is set to 0.4. When roughness is set to 0, metallic is also set to 0.4. When metallic is set to 1, roughness is set to 0.4, and so forth. So you can see here, when metallic is cranked all the way up to 100%, we get a very polished finish. So it looks like polished metal. Whereas if metallic is cranked down to 0, we get a flat finish. So you can think of it as kind of like wall paint. Do you want a satin finish, in which case metallic is 1, or do you want a flat finish, in which case you're going to take metallic down to 0. Now, I also want you to notice that for the shadows, the position for every one of these 4 objects is set to behind object. That makes a big difference. Notice if I set shadows, the position of the shadows, to below object instead, we get these very different effects, even though we're still looking at roughness 1, 0, and metallic 1, 0. So just by way of comparison, once again, this is what things look like when the position of the shadows is behind the object. This is how things look when the position of the shadows is set to below the object. So very different looking effects indeed. And so I just want you to know that shadows have a profound effect on the properties associated with 3D materials inside Illustrator. I felt like you could just use more than extruded type, so I also did some spheres. We've got some polished spheres going on here. Again, the other property in each case is set to 0.4, just so it's locked down, just so we're comparing apples to apples. And the shadow's position this time around is set to behind object. Notice how much reflectivity we get around the shiny sphere when the roughness is set to 0. So this pretty much tells the story, and things look quite a bit different if I set the position of the shadows to below the object. We get this effect here, including this interesting shine along the bottom of the sphere. So once again, roughness 1, matte, roughness 0, shiny, metallic 1, polished, a very polished metal feel and or appearance, that is. In having metallic set to 0, we get a very flat appearance. All right, so let's actually apply these guys to that text I created just a moment ago. I'll select it with the black arrow tool. I'll go up to the window menu and choose 3D and materials to bring back this panel. Now this time around, we don't want to use a fancy material. We just want to use the default. So I'm going to scroll all the way up the list right there and click on base material, that default material right there, which will get rid of the wax paint material that I applied a moment ago. Unfortunately, I left ray tracing on, so I'm going to have to suffer through the progress bar. But you know what? I'll go ahead and turn it off so we don't have that problem once again. So we're just using that default base material. And notice now down here in the properties area, we don't have that long list of properties. We just have the two, roughness and metallic, and these are their default settings. That's why I went with 0.4 for the demos, by the way. You can take roughness all the way up to 1. Remember that, at which point you're going to get a matte finish. When the render's turned off, you're not really going to see it that much, but notice, check out the bottoms of the letters. If I take the roughness value down to 0, we are going to get a little bit of shine at the base of those letters on the extruded edges. And we're going to be able to see that even a little more if I switch to lighting and turn the shadows on like so. And I'm going to go ahead and take the shadow bounds value, just so we have a lot of room for those shadows, up to 100%. The shadow bounds value also affects, is what I'm trying to say, the amount of reflectivity that you're going to see, in this case, along those bottom extruded edges. So that's something to bear in mind as well. You can play around with changing the position to below object, in which case you're going to have to adjust the lighting as well. In other words, if I switch this to below object, it's going to look pretty bad at first, but then I can rotate that light around, the light source around, so that we get a better sense for what things look like. The shadows are in back of the letters, by the way. You'd have to rotate them forward in order to see those shadows. I'm not going to worry about that, however, so I'm just going to undo a bunch of times until we get the position of the shadows back behind where they were before, and then I'll switch back to materials so that, notice my roughness is way down. You can now play with the metallic value independently if you like. That's going to look pretty rotten. That is just a big metallic value without any roughness. So what I'm going to do is add a little bit of roughness as well. So I'm going to set roughness to 0.5. Once again, that's 50%. I've got metallic cranked up to 0.7, which is the functional equivalent of 70%, at which point I'll go ahead and click this down pointing arrowhead up here in the top right corner of the panel, and I'll turn on ray tracing. Make sure quality is set to high. I'll turn off reduce noise in this particular version of Illustrator. I'll click on raster settings right there, and just so that we can eliminate some of that noise, I'll set the resolution to high, click OK, and then click render. Now, this is going to take some time to render. We will see a progress bar. You may even see Illustrator freak out a little bit and say, I always appreciate this when we see not responding up in the title tab. That's always encouraging, but don't worry about it. It's going to make it through. And so we are going to speed things up fairly dramatically. In the end, we achieve this effect, which notice we're just seeing all this bounce here, very shiny letters going on, and we have the shine and reflectivity coming out into the shadows as well. And that is how you take advantage of the two base properties associated with 3D materials, roughness and metallic. All right, now we're going to test drive a material, by which I mean exactly that. I want you to be able to have the bravery to just jump behind the wheel of a material and give it the gas and make it your own. And so we're going to start with where we are so far, and we're going to turn it into this masterwork right here. So shiny, don't you think? All right, so the first thing you want to do is select that 3D type. That's the first thing I want to do anyway. And then the second thing you want to do before you make a dreadful mistake is switch away from ray tracing to the real-time preview, because otherwise you're going to apply a material and it's going to take an hour and a half. We don't want that. So just go ahead and switch back to that real-time preview so you don't hate yourself later. And then I'm going to twirl open, or expand if you prefer, the Adobe Substance materials, which are what they're called right now. These are all the materials that ship with Illustrator. And I'm going to go down to this guy right here. I can't guarantee it's going to be there, but for now it is. It's called Oxford Fabric, and it's pretty darn cool. And you end up right out of the gate with this effect here. And because we're working with the real-time preview, it didn't take 5 minutes for that to occur. All right, now I'm going to scroll down a little bit here, and I want you to notice these main parameters, resolution and repeat. These are very common, by the way, and they have to do with the underlying pattern that's at the root of a material like this. And it's not just a pattern. It's also, in other words, it's not just a visual pattern. It's also very potentially rendered as a normal map, and learn more about that later. But for now, I just want you to see that we've got two items here. Resolution is basically how big the pattern is. So you can think of it as by default measuring 1024 pixels wide by 1024 pixels tall. That is not strictly speaking necessarily the case, but that is more or less what's going on here. And so notice if I reduce the resolution, I am going to end up with less detail associated with that effect. So in other words, the 512 pixels are being stretched out over the same course, and so we've got kind of a fuzzier effect. Whereas if I increase the resolution to its maximum, in this case 2048 pixels, then we see the same amount of pattern going on, it's just higher detail. So higher resolution. Now this little eye thing is just telling you that the resolution also depends on the document raster effect settings. Actually, they're totally two different things, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. What I would worry about, or at least have fun with, is this repeat value. So how many times do you want to repeat the pattern? So if you increase that repeat value, you are going to make the pattern tighter, if that makes any sense. If you reduce the value, it's going to make it looser. So you're going to have bigger, chunkier fabric in this case. I'm going to take it down to 50. 100, by the way, is the default. I'm going to take it down to 50 so we have these big, chunky pieces of fabric. All right, now I'm going to scroll down this list so that you can see that we have warp yarn color and weft yarn colors. So I don't know anything about this, but I did a little bit of research, and the warp threads go up and down lengthwise, and then the weft threads hold the warp threads together. They go back and forth, so they're woven back and forth, don't you know? If you know more than I do, definitely comment to your heart's content, but that's all I got for you. But what I am going to tell you is I want to change the colors. So I'm going to click on this warp yarn color thing right here, swatch, in order to bring up the color picker dialog box. I'm going to dial in a hue value. This is just the way I like to work. 270, which is falls into the violet camp. Set the saturation at 20 and take the brightness value up to 100%, so we have this kind of lilac. And then I'll click OK. And now I'm going to contrast that. Notice that that changes right away. You can see those warp yarns every other sort of square. And now I'm going to change the other ones by clicking on the Weft yarn color in order to bring up the color picker dialog box once again. And I'll change this time the hue to 260 degrees. I'll go with a saturation value of 30% and a brightness value of 80%. This is just what I came up with, at which point I'll click OK. And now we have some darker purples at work there. All right, now remember roughness and metallic. You may have just been thinking to yourself, gee whiz, Deke, you emphasize roughness and metallic so much when really the main items are resolution, repeat, and color. But actually, roughness and metallic find their ways into a lot of different parameters. So in this case, we have independent roughness and metallic for both the warp and the weft. And so I just goofed off here. Just play. I'm encouraging you to play with this stuff as well. I want some nice shiny warp, so I'm going to take the roughness value down to 0. Remember, a rough of 1 is rough, and it's matte, and a rough of 0 is nice and shiny. And then I'm going to set metallic to the equivalent of 50%, which is 0.5. So again, don't get your feelings hurt or anything that the range is just 0 to 1. You have a lot of decimals to work with in the meantime. And now I'm going to set the weft roughness, just for the sake of variety, to 0.35. Oops, that's getting in the way. 0.35, which is the equivalent of 35%. And I'll set the metallic to the equivalent of 65%, which is 0.65, like so. There are lots of other parameters to play with, as you can see if you scroll down here, but nothing that we need to worry about just right this second. We'll come to some of those later. However, this is a good point. After playing with what we've got and making this kind of headway, this is the time at which you want to go ahead and once again turn on ray tracing, and then probably leave the room is a really great idea and let Illustrator just do its thing, you know. But bring up the progress bar if ever it decides to do that, and say things, helpful things like it's not responding, and have a big thick border around the 3D panel. But you know, just have faith. It's better not to look at these things, and hopefully, if nothing else, that makes you feel really super good that you didn't try to do all that work with ray tracing turned on. But I want you to notice that the warp stuff, that is the up and down guys, the lighter threads are shinier than the darker ones. So the lighter ones are shinier because we have a low roughness value, and the darker ones are more metallic because we have a higher metallic value. And so if nothing else, I hope that helps you understand what's going on with resolution, repeat, as well as these color and various roughness and metallic values when working with 3D materials here inside Illustrator 2022 and going forward. Thank you so much for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe. Want to learn more? Universal adjustments such as position and technical parameters, a few ways to blend multiple materials, the basics of loading and applying still more materials in order to create something as crazy awesome as this. Well, you're in luck. I got you covered at patreon.com/DekeNow. And you can while away some time at Deke.com. Not to brag, but I also possess the name Deke McClellan. This is Illustrator Now.